Good day and welcome to the Conference Board's Human Capital Watch webcast, The Future of Work, Frontline Challenges in the Era of Digital Transformation. So just a few things before we get started. Some of the critical questions and issues that we'll be looking at today. We're going to look at how HR can and what it should be doing to lead organizational change in an era of digital transformation. What does a digitally transformed organization actually look like? And what are the most crucial characteristics of the future HR function? What is HR going to look like a few years, 5 years down the road when it comes to managing digital transformation? And we'll discuss a little bit about an emerging issue, and that's that kind of organizational data, that polluted data, if you will, from legacy and unconscious bias that sometimes creeps in or often creeps into to an organization's data. For those of you looking for credits on this webcast, you need to stay online for the entire webcast. As this slide dictates, you need to specify which organization you're getting credits from. And there'll be a pop-up box that comes up throughout the webcast. You need to type in your name, email address, and click OK for those pop-ups to ensure that you do get the credits that you're looking for. Just participating in this webcast, we're really looking to have an interactive webcast today. So there's a checkbox question on the bottom left that you can put in, and you'll be able to download the presentation afterwards and share with colleagues. So really excited today to have on with us some fellow presenters. In the studio with me is Michael Fontaine, who's the National Managing Partner for Human Resources at KPMG.
Thanks, Chuck. Appreciate it.
And from sunny New Jersey, we have Gitanjali Gamal, who's Head of Global Workforce Analytics and Planning at Merck.
Thanks, Chuck. Glad to be here.
So without further ado, let's get started. So what we're really looking at is this webcast is based on a report. It was coming from a global joint council meeting. We had 250 HR executives in Chicago in May to discuss really the future of work and the future of the HR function. The meeting objective was to get that perspective from the HR function on how digital transformation is going to impact business organizations and what HR can do to facilitate that change. And one of the things about using this report, it's really a good conversation starter within an organization. I think it poses a lot of questions and issues that organizations and the HR function itself will need to address going forward. So. Going forward, so we start with some of the insights from the crowd, and this is really, again, this 250 HR executives in Chicago, and some of the big notions that surfaced at this meeting is that HR in an area of digital transformation needs to disrupt itself. It's about framing questions and challenges and new paradigms and getting away from the old aspect of work. And HR in an area of digital transformation needs a comprehensive digital strategy of its own. We see this also in other functions where application of specific technologies to specific processes is not enough to foresee the transformation and to align with the business strategy of an organization. So each function, and specifically HR, is going to need its own digital strategy. And finally, when we come to digital transformation, organizations tend to emphasize the digital part. And actually, digital transformation really has that human element side, the behavioral side, and it requires empathy for those being affected. The notion of change and change management, resilience within the workforce is critical. And it's important to remind people it's about the evolution of jobs and not their elimination. So digital transformation actually, as we see, has this huge ripple effect on organizations. And we start with that center bullet point of the central elements of digital transformation. But as you see, it broadens out into business impacts and then onto the human capital function itself. So you can see everything changes, everything needs to be readjusted. So just to go back, let me ask Michael about that notion about HR having a digital strategy of its own. What are the essential elements? How does an HR function begin to develop its strategy? Who does it need to cooperate with?
We found that first we had to cooperate with the business leaders and actually back up to understand what their business strategy was and what the challenges were that were facing the organization. And then tying an HR strategy to that, and then a digital strategy to the HR strategy. So without understanding the business challenges, the environment that the business is operating in, we felt as though that if we started with an HR strategy or an HR digital strategy, that we would be disconnected from what we're ultimately trying to serve, which is the business, right? HR is primarily here to serve the business and the workforce, and not to digitally transform itself for the sake of doing so.
Right. Yeah. So that alignment with business strategy is the critical part. I mean, I think sure HR can't go out on its own and be a rogue, if you will, when it comes to that notion. There needs to be alignment.
The second piece, though, was a really strong alignment with the CIO and the Chief Digital Officer organization, because as they were building the digital strategy for the organization, built off of the same business challenges, we needed to be aligned with them in the same endeavor.
And the CIOs are on board on all this? Or?
They are. They're absolutely. It's being driven enterprise-wide, and HR is on the frontier of driving it.
Mm-hmm. That's good points. And Gitanjali, on your side, that notion of the digital strategy, but also the part about empathy, engagement in an era of transformation. What are the challenges that you're facing at Merck when it comes to that engagement and let's just say morale of the workforce in an era of digital transformation?
Yes, that's a great question. And, to add to what Michael was saying about making sure that when we think of a digital strategy for HR, we're thinking of the business objectives and the business strategy and aligning with that. I think that's critical. The piece to add to that is at the center of all of this digital transformation is the individual, whether you're thinking about your ultimate, end consumer, you're thinking about your employees in the case of HR. And I think that's something that we take very seriously, and we have a very purposeful approach to make sure that digitization is also about enhancing that experience for the employee or the human being, the person at the center of it. You mentioned a great word, empathy. I think that's very key to when we think about things like how do we redesign processes, right? So the idea of bringing in design thinking, I think it's mostly about, it's an empathy exercise, the way I think about it. So it's about co-creating new processes. It's about thinking about how do we provide better learning experiences using digital technologies to help people get the skills that they need or get the attitudes that they need to develop to stay current and keep at pace in a fast-changing digital world. So I think that's something that's incredibly important, is to focus on the individual and have a lot of empathy, have good change management practices, and great communication as you do that.
No, that's a good point. And I think it's an interesting, and we'll probably jump a little bit ahead here on where we are on our slide deck, but I think you raise a really interesting point about the evolving workforce. We have heard from a lot of organizations that it's you can't hire your way out of a digital talent shortage, and with the way and currently with skills, digital skills being outdated in 18 months to 24 months, is it the right notion to hire for skills, or hire for more for attitude, if you will? And that you mentioned the continuous learning. Is that a strategy that works? I mean, the evolving workforce, as opposed to trying to hire your way out of a digital talent shortage. Potentially, you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. Again, great question. I think I agree with you. I don't think you can hire your way completely out of that question. I think it's important to think about certain, I would say, attitudes or competencies like adaptability in a digital world. The ability to take certain risks, to be willing to disrupt yourself. When we're talking about HR as an organization being willing to do something like that, we have to understand it's a collective of people. So it's each of those individuals having the ability and the willingness to do that. So I think that's something that is a mix of both hiring for those kind of attitudes, but also building that in-house. Because I don't think we can just completely think that the solution is in hiring a set of people with completely different skill sets. I think we still need certain depth of skills in certain areas, but we also need a different mindset or attitude, and that culture has to be built. And part of that is how we also bring in then, the digital platforms. Like we have a great digital learning platform that's really helping push the cultural change around having a learning mindset, having a mindset of continuous learning, and while we are doing that, we're also providing people a great user experience through this like on-the-go, bite-sized digital platform that they can use on different devices. So I think it's got to be a mix of sort of building it in-house and also trying to find the right sort of mindset as we hire and as we develop our existing workforce.
Michael, skill versus attitude.
I think it's behaviors. So for me, it's behaviors and culture. So is the person that's coming into the organization a cultural fit, and at times can they be a cultural disruptor? So I think courage plays a large part in how you help an organization see through a transformation. We're experiencing, I think, some of the same points that Gitanjali mentioned. We're actually building a world-class learning and innovation center, and the word innovation is coupled with learning in Florida for KPMG. It actually opens in 2020. It's become really the centerpiece that we have from a cultural standpoint. It's being fit with the latest in digital technologies from a learning perspective, but it's also being thought of about the employee experience. There's an entire team looking at how we start with an empathy perspective and how we're designing that. So I think it's a multiple pieces, and it's a mix, as you said. I think the contingents, and I know we'll talk about that afterwards, plays a large part in this as well. So you have to be able to supplement the digital skills that you either have or not have from the marketplace. I think digital transformations will continue, and it's not a new fad, and it won't certainly be one, and it won't be something that will be short-lived. But you have to be able to bring in, I think, a good mix of internal and external experts to create that feed and that energy and that mindset creation to move the organization forward. But I would start with not just skills, but definitely behaviors and culture and how that fits.
That's a good point, and I think that notion of to build, rent, or buy is
a big question.
Right. It's going to be a good one. So now we're going to ask the audience to be involved here with our first polling question. That we ask you about your views on leaders and employees and their skill levels within the organization. So if we can bring up those poll questions. Okay, so the first question is, do your leaders currently have the skills and knowledge necessary to make your organization successful in a digitalized world? Okay. Okay. I'm not seeing the results at the moment. Let me just see for a second. Oh, here we go. Right, so those that strongly agree, 16% say that they strongly agree, that they think that their leaders do, and somewhat agree is more in the 50% range. Our second polling question that we'd like to go to is now asking about employees. Do your employees have those skills and knowledge necessary to make your organization successful in a digital world? Polls open. Okay, okay, so the poll is now closed. It's interesting. Just over 5% strongly agree that the employees do have those skills that are necessary for digital organizations. So if we go to the next, we're at the next slide, and this is from our CEO survey, our C-suite survey. It's a survey, global survey of CEOs and C-suite executives this is the 20th year we've done this. If we look at those bottom two results, right, that identical questions, and this is the CEO response globally, that in the U.S. it's about 8.5% of CEOs strongly agreed that their leaders have those skills, and the employees, it's similar to our poll results. Just over almost 8%, 4.7% believe that their employees have the skills. So it's interesting that the view here is that the leaders are more knowledgeable and more equipped than the employees at this point in time. So, Michael, what's your reaction to this?
Well, I might disagree. I mean, I think in some respects they are, because it's a topic that's top of mind for them, and they're looking at how they transform their organizations. But if you think about the populations that are happening inside of our firms today, we just swung to almost over 60% of a millennial population at KPMG. I mean, this group is digital natives. They've grown up with digital, and I think the challenge that we have as leaders is to meet them at the front door with the same types of technologies and tools that we've all become accustomed to at home, right? So I think any one of us in HR can use a number of examples of, at home we surf on Google or Amazon, on our phones while on the train or on a plane or on a bus, and you can buy what you want, but you come into an HR organization and you're back to almost online versions of spreadsheets, right? So I think we have to learn from the employee population, but the leaders have to know, how to invest and where to push the envelope and where we need to go.
Interesting point. Contingent, how about you? Do you buy in that the leaders are perhaps better equipped than the employees at this point in time to get to the digitized promised land?
No, I think I concur with what Michael said. I think to his point, there's this whole Sunday to Monday effect that we speak of, where on Sunday you're connected, you're digital, at home or on the go, and Monday you come to work, and sometimes the systems and the technology doesn't match your experience the day before. So that's something that we continue to work on, closing that gap. And I think there's a lot of potential in actually leveraging what our employees who, as consumers or as individuals outside of work, the savviness that they already have by working in a world that is very digital, by bringing that into the workplace, we have to actually meet them. And I think Michael made the same point, that we have to meet them in the middle and provide them with the infrastructure, to enable that. So I think there's actually a lot of opportunity to do that.
Our HR leaders from around the globe together last year in Palo Alto, and we actually spent a day at Stanford doing design thinking first and immersed ourselves in that. And as part of the 3-day conference that we had, we brought 10 millennials in from around the world to be part of the HR leaders' discussions. And the conversations that they helped us have opened, sort of the old dog's eyes, and in some ways, what we're thinking about. And I had one individual from the UK who said, even the learning technology needs to know that I'm on the tube in London, and I have 15 minutes between where I'm getting on the tube and I'm getting off at the office, and why won't it send to me a 15-minute learning module that I have to take to stay relevant on my skills? And that, to me, just sort of brought together, this mindset of what we're, maybe either have been tending to design or can be satisfied with from our generation. Our generation, and the boomers will also say, that they were fine with spreadsheets. We lived with them for years, so why should we change? But that's not the consumerism that's really being driven to mobile devices. So we have to think differently about it.
Good point. Really good point. And just to stay on the slide for a few minutes, we've talked a lot about culture and the notion of culture, the importance of culture in digital transformation. I mean, that's, we define digitization versus digital transformation. Digitization just being that kind of ad hoc application of technology to a specific process, where digital transformation is that cultural shift enterprise-wide. And there's a big difference. A lot of companies, a lot of organizations, I think, kind of pat themselves on the back that they're digitally transforming by just simply applying technology to specific functions or specific processes. So I think that's always one red flag. But when we look at these CEO results that are up here now, the two fundamental building blocks of digital transformation is that vision of a digitally transformed organization and new business models, and also having an understanding of that digital ecosystem. And when you look at when you look at these results, that China being a little bit of an outlier, there's a little more confidence that among CEOs that they have that vision and they have that understanding of the ecosystem. But U.S. and particularly Europe, those numbers are not very encouraging. So I think that starts to address the cultural issue. If you don't have the vision, can you go forward with cultural transformation? Gitanjali, what do you think?
That's a tough one. I do think that vision is very important, right? So I think you have to have the vision first to at least imagine what good looks like, to start working towards it, to set that as your objective, as your goal, and drive a cultural transformation, or sometimes I would even say a series of cultural tweaks if transformation is too big to take on, to bite off at first. But I think even to drive that, you do need a vision of what's possible and what's absolutely needed, to stay at pace with the pace of technology and the expectations of the consumers, of the employees, of the individual from an organization. So I think it's important to have that vision. I don't think these results necessarily indicate that organizations in the U.S. don't have that vision. I think there's cultural differences, demographic differences between an emerging economy, and a developed economy that sometimes will lead to these differences in the type of poll numbers that we're seeing. But I definitely do believe in the importance of leaders having that vision.
Yes. Michael, culture?
I agree. I mean, from what we've seen, I think digital transformation was happening in pieces and pockets across the firm. Even inside of HR, there were different groups that had, talent acquisition, for example, is always, on the cutting edge of the marketplace because they're thinking about how are they sourcing and bringing in, employees and contingents into the firm. But then the different business units themselves have different levels of, I think, digital transformation skills. What we found that was essential, and we've just really started completing that part of the journey, was to ensure that our digital transformation leader, he actually brought a complete vision with his team and our advisory consulting practice to the firm to net all of that together, right? So as opposed to each of us going off on our own and doing digital transformation in HR, finance, audit, tax, and all the pieces of the business, that it required an enterprise-wide vision that we could all get behind, or almost get behind the icebreaker and get into the wake and help push it forward.
That's a good point. So you have a digital transformation officer who's...
We do.
Right.
We do.
And Gitanjali, does Merck have an overseer of that digital transformation and that kind of digital transformation officer type role?
We have, we have a digital strategy office and a realization office, and as of today, we have a new incoming chief digital officer as well. So more to come on that front.
Okay, is that just throwing out the notion is that is maybe a role that someday just vanishes as digital as an organization is transformed, right? Good. Work yourself out of a job. I think I've done that before. I'm pretty good at that. So just looking at some of the success factors that come in, digital transformation, the whole nature of work changes. We're looking at the future of work, and that notion of we've termed it partly the Hollywood effect, where these fluid teams form around projects, cross-functional, different, just diverse and inclusive teams. And inclusive is an important word here, I think. That come together around projects, form, disband, like you would making a movie in Hollywood or Bollywood or anywhere. These teams shed their capabilities as they go forward, and it decentralizes decision making and greater transparency and information sharing. I think one of the notions, let's just talk a little bit about leadership in a digital era here, that greater transparency and information sharing. Leaders, one of the things that we hear from members, and one of the biggest challenges, is that leaders, especially at that middle management level where knowledge has always been power, and that transparency and information sharing requires a little back down on the ego side. Gitanjali, do you see that as a challenge among your workforce?
Yes, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest things about, some of the advantages of living in this digital workforce and having personalized recommendations and personalized service and all of these things available to us is that there's a trade-off, which means on the back end of that, that requires information flows, and it requires people to be willing to share their data to enable it. And I think that raises a whole debate that I'm sure we won't be able to get through that in, for days if we talked about it, much less in a few minutes. But I think, to me, the way we tackle that, or the way we work through it, is thinking about the value proposition. I think a great example that someone once shared with me was that if you think about something like Google Maps, where we're willing to let someone know where we are at all times because it's a compelling enough value and service that we get in return. So I think part of it is being transparent about how information is being used, how it's being used the right way with the right controls in place. But it's also about the value proposition. I think if that is strong enough, some of the issues around ego or not wanting to share information or having being anxiety around what data is being used and what's being looked at, I think that can really help smooth those issues over. So that's the way we try to think about it.
Michael, your thoughts?
I agree, and I also think that a key piece of this is remaining connected with the business as you do this, right? So I think a challenge for all of us in HR is to remember, as you're going through this type of a transformation, again, is to not just look at how you transform for yourself, but how do you stay connected? And it forces different pieces of HR to collaborate in new ways. It forces businesses to collaborate in new ways. I think many firms in the U.S. and globally have looked at one firm strategies or one HR strategies, and I think those are paramount to starting this off. But I think that as you head into this journey, I think it's important to realize the expertise in where it sits in an organization. I think firms that are smart are federating the digital transformation teams, less so than swooping them up and moving them into a centralized organization. When you say the word centralization, which is key in process transformation ahead of digital, that tends to make people nervous because they hear centralization, they think that you're taking their teams, you're taking their resources, and you're taking their power. And I think as HR leaders, we have to find new ways to engage with folks on that discussion and to assure them that we are, hi, we're from corporate, we're here to help, so to speak. But really, we're here to partner with you and learn from you and be a facilitator of the discussion, not the controlling mechanism by which that happens.
So you mentioned the majority millennial. Is there a generational difference do you see a generational difference when it comes to the fluidity or the willingness to be more transparent? You mentioned about teaching old dogs new tricks, but do you see that within your work? Is there is it intrinsically more in the millennial DNA to share?
I think they've just grown up that way, and not that we haven't either, because I think there's a lot of us who are highly collaborative, whether we've come from, regardless of which generation we've been from. But I think it's about, again, it goes back to the behavior and the cultures and how you connect that with the fabric of your organization. I think the millennials will teach us things in new ways and help us to move faster than we normally would. But again, and I try to remind people as we're doing the design for what we're working on, that we're not designing it for the people who are here in power today. We're not designing it for the people in their roles today. You've got to look at your process and your philosophy and redesign it and think about what it needs to be tomorrow, so that as you're architecting and building your digital transformation, you're not instantly out of date with what we're trying to do. So you've got to take yourself, and it goes back to that whole empathy and design thinking mode. It's not just what your customers want today, but what do they see that they're going to need tomorrow, and design towards that. Or else you'll just be, it'll be a never-ending cycle and you won't catch up.
Right. Good point. So just to carry on, so again, these are insights, the wisdom of the crowd, if you will, that came from the Strategic HR Joint Council meeting in Chicago. And then one of the notions that really surfaced is this notion, we've talked a little bit about it, is the design thinking, putting yourself in the HR, your customers' shoes. Gitanjali, could you tell us a little bit about, you've mentioned design thinking at Merck, and how does it working for you in the HR sphere? How are the skills there within the function? Is there examples of how design thinking's worked and maybe in some cases well, in some cases not so well? And what are the essential elements of having that design thinking team in there? Who's on it?
Absolutely. So when we started thinking about digital transformation, which, as you know, is sort of an ongoing process, right? In some ways, I don't think it's ever done. But one of the key things that we wanted to focus on was, again, this user experience and thinking about, are we keeping what people want and what they will need in the future, as Michael said, in mind, and how do we do that effectively? And to be honest, we realized that we don't necessarily have people who had design thinking expertise in-house. Like, that was not something that we had proactively hired for or trained for to begin with. But realizing that, I think that the first kind of taking stock and realizing that is important. And then the next step was that, okay, so what do we do now? How do we get the right skills, the right methodology, the right framework to begin with? So we built some external partnerships as well with experts who had been working in this field. We co-created some solutions with them, along with people in-house at Merck who were able to then pick up that process and that skill, and more importantly, the mindset of when you start out thinking about what are say, the two moments that matter the most to employees when we're thinking of redesigning a process. And that was incredibly important, because when we think about, for example, something like onboarding of employees, it's really important to keep that employee experience in mind, make sure that they are successful as they onboard onto the company, and then add value through productivity and performance for the company. And all of that, it's not easy to map out this entire process, but we did that as a collaborative exercise, thinking about the various points in the journey of that new employee, and then really using that sort of template or mindset and trying to use that in a repeatable fashion for different user experiences and journeys. And I think that's been incredibly helpful in building up internally our skill set and our mindset around design thinking, but also in really improving some of the processes, or in some cases completely redesigning them.
Michael, design thinking at KPMG, where are we with that?
Well, it's a journey, I think, for all of us. I think we're just starting on it. We've done some things. I think Gitanjali said in one of her opening comments, what we are really starting to think about more than what we have been. So I think the transformation word scares people. It makes them nervous, right? And I've seen that in our own HR team as we've talked about it. So our focus is enhancing the employee and partner experience. So that's how we're now really talking about this. We've done a few things. We actually had a intelligent automation and cognitive boot camp back in the summer, where we had some of our leading thinkers in that space come to HR. We had 36 people in a room together. We talked about, what does it really mean to think about intelligent automation? What does that do to our processes? We created an RPA team in HR and connected it into the digital transformation organization. We started that in February, and we just released our 18th bot yesterday. We've trained about 16 people around that team, and folks, since they've now been trained in that methodology, they're thinking through their processes with new eyes and saying, "Wow, why am I doing this way? This could do this for me to free up time for me to do something else." And then, even though parts of our digital transformation have started, tomorrow we're actually having our kickoff for all of HR, for our HR transformation and digital transformation. We're sort of constituting the team, the cross-functional team that you mentioned earlier. And what we'll be focused on is personas, and thinking about exactly what Gitanjali just talked about, is those moments that matter. So we're going to be holding what's called window of opportunity workshops, where we're going to think about a process holistically. How do we redesign it through the lens of the employee, through the lens of the business, before we start to lift and shift it into digital environments.
Right, as you say, it's a journey and it's not easy. I think one of the things that's interesting and that we hear too from our members is that there's this paradigm shift of digital transformation going, organizations and business models going from product centric to a customer centric, which is really about cultural shift. But one other observation that came out is that under the old paradigm, it was IT that needed to speak the language of business, and that's kind of flipped now. From what I hear you both talking about, it's the business side that now has to speak IT, right? I think it's an interesting point, and I'm hearing that loud and clear from both of you. So, one thing that also came up is the notion of agile methodology, and agile as it applies into the HR function. It's that iterative innovation part. Less than perfect is okay to roll out. Product user feedback, part of the design thinking mode, all comes back in. It was interesting at this meeting that there was not a lot of confidence, or there were very few examples of anyone at this point in time that was using agile effectively within the HR function. Are either of you on that journey yet? How's that playing out? Is there plans? How would you begin? Michael?
Sure. I think we are. We probably haven't called it that. We haven't probably thought of it that way either. But for example, we're just releasing our new succession planning module on our HCM cloud system next week. And it actually was done through a series of sprints. And as opposed to doing an absolutely perfect big bang the first time out, we're releasing part of it to one population for decision making coming up here in the fall, and then doing phase 2 and releasing it for a larger population in the spring. I already talked about the bots, so that's another example of it. And then in our talent acquisition organization, we have just got done doing a new ATS system in the past few years, and we're constantly evolving what we need to do. So I think there's something, as you go through a digital transformation, to understand not to provide all the functionality to your audience at once. I've seen that it tends to overwhelm them, and then they sort of revoke and rebuke against the system. But to have enough of the functionality there so that you already have what the next iteration is in mind, and they're asking you for it. So as they're saying, can you turn it to do this? You're going, absolutely we can. But you sort of held back on that. So it's almost an agile iteration, but that's being customer driven and transparent.
But not using that terminology as such. That's you're right. You know it when you see it, right? How about at Merck?
Yeah, very similar. That I think it's been about driving comfort level around the whole concept of a minimal viable product. About taking an iterative approach. I think just in the way we've rolled out various platforms, we've gotten people more and more comfortable with that approach without sort of naming it, that agile is coming to HR. We haven't used those words, but I think that's essentially, moving towards agility and being comfortable with this approach of not having just one large implementation of everything, at this one big reveal. So I think we're getting there. We're also starting to get more and more into like piloting, experimenting, and I think that's another thing it's critical in this, this journey or this cultural transformation, if you will.
I think that brings up an interesting point too. That as you do the iterative sort of innovation, less than perfect product. There's a lot of lip service, I think, paid within organizations, and this is what we hear from our members constantly, is that, failure, it's nice to say failure's tolerated and it's okay, fail fast and learn, but people still get dinged for it, right? So that's part of a cultural change, but do you feel that in your organizations that you're making progress towards that? I mean, has that... is it okay to fail without career jeopardy? Realistically, and then how do you begin to change that mindset, which is an important part if we're looking at design thinking and agile for whatever term we use in program development. So, Contingent, you want to take that first, or?
Yeah, sure. I think first thing is also understanding the culture and the context of your organization, the type of business we're in. we're not a fail fast and break things culture. We know that, right? And that won't work for us in many ways. So once we have that realization, now what can we do to create this environment of safety where people can design things in a way that they can take risks, that we can be innovative, but at the same time, we're also doing that in a pragmatic fashion. And that's something that we are actually quite proactive about. And hence, the examples that I said about doing things, in a pilot mode or a smaller experiment, knowing that not all experiments are successful and not all of them get converted into enterprise-wide solutions or initiatives. I think that's a great testament to the fact that we are really taking that seriously. We also continue to use, since I'm from an analytics side, I can definitely say that when it comes through various survey vehicles or other, listening approaches, that is definitely a question that we pay attention to: is how safe do people feel to fail, to take risks, it's a journey. We continue to work on that, but it's something that's very important to us.
I've just been at KPMG just about 2 years, coming up in January, and in my time, I can feel as though that folks are definitely taking risks around transformation. We have 11 different transformations going on in addition to the digital transformation, so there's much happening. So I would say that it's clearly heading in that direction, but we also really, I think, take the time to look at our survey feedback every year. We're doing a whole new reinvestment in our culture and our values, taking a good hard long look at ourselves as we progress. The HR strategy is actually a 3-pillar strategy. One is building workforce capability, which is all around talent and learning. The second one is all around amplifying our culture and our values, which is around innovation and employer of choice and purpose and all the key pieces. And the third one is industry and technological disruption. So the three of them, I think, have to fit together. Gitanjali said a point that I was thinking of as you originally asked the question too. I think it depends upon your industry and the culture of your firm at the same time and the organization that you're in. For those of us who work in highly regulated environments, there tends to be a much higher degree of risk intolerance. Piloting things becomes dangerous at times. So it has to have the right safety, as she mentioned, kind of placed around things. Defense, pharmaceutical, professional services and audit, right, definitely has a much higher degree of regulation. And as you roll out new processes, you kind of have to make sure that it's thoroughly road tested with those organizations before you light the candle on it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I've had some experience with the Development Bank of Singapore, which, Asian culture, banking culture, to rather risk-averse notions, if you will, right, the hierarchy, power to distance thing in Asia. And it was interesting that their innovation team at Development Bank of Singapore doesn't make anything. They are purely a cultural transition team. They go to business units, encouraging them to take risk and to partner outside the organization to bring in some of the more agile thoughts, processes in. But their issue was recognizing failure, very, very difficult in both the banking and that culture in Singapore. And the CEO there very publicly doesn't recognize failure, recognizes effort, and that's how they kind of framed it. And it made things a little more easier, more tolerable in so many ways. Not all the efforts were successful, but they recognized the effort, and that's what they were trying to get to change the behavior. So it's an interesting aside.
Yeah, one other point too. I mean, I found that a lot of us who work in regulated industries have a risk management organization, and as opposed to designing without them and then telling them later what you've designed, to involve them in your process from the start, just like you would communication and diversity and any other group that you want to make sure that's part of the ultimate end design. Invite them to the table. They'll usually help you navigate the risks better than you could, with your own blinders on.
Right, I know, and just on from our Chief Legal Officers Council, when we talk about cultural transitions, but trying to go from saying no all the time to yes, we can do this. So all of that needs to come together within an organization at any one time. Just another point that came up at the Chicago meeting, the HR executives there were struggling to some extent on how to, as digital transformation makes the creation of fluid teams critical, how to value that team, that work in teams, how to reward it. The way it's set up now, the centerpiece of a lot of performance management, human capital is individual performance. It's almost pitting people on a one-to-one type of competition, and now we're looking at rewarding teams. And there was an issue or struggle with how to realign that compensation and reward when it comes to value and teamwork. Are you doing anything at either of your organizations that looks at that issue? This is a real baffler for a lot of people.
I find it interesting that this is back on the docket, right? Because this was a big conversation at business school, 24 years ago. Unfortunately, time has gone by, but it's back on again, right? And I'm surprised that we don't know how to work in teams better than we do, because all through business school and even master's degrees and any programs that any of us on the call and the webcast have taken, we all had to do projects in teams, right? And it was probably the hardest part of your degree program. Someone always became the aggregator of everyone else's information or tried to put things in one voice. But I'm curious to why we haven't sort of licked that as an organization yet, because part of your grade in those schools were your team projects, right? And everybody had to work together for the better outcome of the organization. I haven't seen it, play out as well as I think it should in performance, and I think we all have to take a fresh look at it.
Yeah, fair point. Gitanjali, is there anything at Merck that I imagine with all your R&D and innovation that's all around teams that it's a challenge?
Yeah, and I can't say that that there's a clear solution that I have from a performance perspective to offer. I think it's a difficult problem to solve, but it's an important one. A different lens to it, I would say, is the first thing right now is more importantly for us to understand how teaming works. How can teaming be more agile, if you will, and more fluid? How can we enable that? How can we empower people to be able to organize themselves in teams around business questions or problems as appropriate? Of course, again, the context of the industry and the type of the work that you're doing is important in that case. But one thing I want to share, this is not around performance, but more around recognition, which I think is starting to get there, is we actually have this great recognition platform. So another sort of plug for digital, where it's really easy for people to go in and recognize each other, whether it's with some points that they can award or say thank you, and it's really helped give people that visibility to the different types of things that are going on in the organization, the types of project work that they may not have had visibility to before. And so it's also opening up that doors for teaming in more creative ways, and also giving the opportunity, for leaders and others to see how different teams may be coming together and starting to recognize them for it. It's not exactly answering the original question you had, I recognize that, but I think it's a good way of trying to think about teams and how we can be a little bit more fluid and enable that.
Great. We have one business unit that actually went to a teaming model for performance, and it seems to be really working well for them. So again, as we start to look at our design, they will be center in that discussion, because I think it could hold for everybody else.
Yeah, I think this has identified an area of research that we at the conference board need to do a lot more work in. Right? It's an opportunity, right? For sure. I'm going to skip through this. We talked about the skills versus attitude notion. So let's just go to the next point. I just think this is more of a little bit of an aside, but one of the ideas that surfaced was that when we were talking about the value or the notion that at one point T-shaped thinkers were considered critical to an organization, and now we've kind of moved across the alphabet or up the alphabet to the notion of an M-shaped thinker. But that kind of it's an interesting concept that and I think it speaks to that notion of forming teams and being fluid across the organization, but not necessarily having the great depth, not being necessarily a subject matter expert who can then move things across across functions or notions, but it's having a little bit less depth, but across more depth across a broader sense of areas, and then being able to share across. So I think it's just an interesting notion. It's kind of one of those little thought provokers that came out of the conference. How you test or how you find someone for M-shape, is a bit of a challenge. But I think we're back to the continuous learning notion. Is this a concept that has surfaced anywhere, or is this still a little more theoretical everywhere?
We'll go first. We'll let it go first.
Yeah. So, we haven't. I wouldn't say that I've heard the T-shaped versus M-shaped that phrasing talked about as much, but this is a topic that does come up in various different ways, which is about how do we get that right amount of depth, and again, and width, and again that changes, right, for us even by business units. If you think about the research side of the house, there's probably some fairly deep expertise required to lead most of those functions. So I don't know if the same model would work as well in research as it might work in marketing. So I think we have to be flexible about that, but I think it's a good it's a good concept to spend some time thinking about as we think of leadership models and how those need to evolve.
I think leadership frameworks and how you think about purposeful succession is key to that, because a lot of folks who've become M-shaped thinkers have been moved around the chessboard with intent, right? As leaders look at succession planning, and you can round people out and build them in different ways. Now, you can't move someone through every different sub-process of your organization, but if someone could get a really good cross-section through their career, it tends to make them much more holistic leaders, and maybe O-shaped, right? So everything is sort of holistic, a new one that we'll have to create.
Let's invent right now. I think that's great. We'll call it the O-shape. But I think the key phrase that you mentioned was with intent, right? So that's the critical part. So let's just move on to contingent workers. We're going to have one more poll question for our audience too. To go directly, when we look at this is from a survey that we've done with CHROs recently. That was about intent to hire and how whether there's been an increase with the hiring of contingent, or let's call it non-traditional workforces. So you can see that the numbers skew significantly towards an intent to increase, and in the past it's been that way. I think, just taking an interesting aside, when we looked at the macro data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the non-traditional workforce, which we cross-defines with contingent workers, there's been little percentage change in the last 20 years, which is interesting in the macro data. But we hear so much on at the firm level of intent to hire. So one of so if we can move to the next poll question real quick. So when it comes to hiring of contingent workers and non-traditional employees, there are concerns, and we've had CEOs express concerns and C-suite individuals express concerns. So on this poll question, if we can bring it up, what are the primary concerns with leveraging non-traditional employees in your organization? Okay, good. So yeah, primary number one on this list is legal issues. That's interesting at 26%. Finding workers with appropriate skills is the first, and legal issues second. By significant margin over the other issues. So when we look at when we again go back to our CEO or C-suite challenge survey, we asked that same question to CEOs. And I guess what comes across here is the CEO, CFO, CHRO, skill shortage is a skill shortage is a skill shortage, right? It's the number one part, same as our audience poll here. But our audience here had the legal issues at number two. And you can see on this list, it's pretty far down the list for CEOs and CFOs, a little higher for CHROs. But what's interesting, I think, is two things. The CEOs don't have a lot of trust in non-traditional or contingent workers when it comes to handling that critical relationship with customers. And then the issue of engagement. And one of the things that we heard is it's not only engaging the non-traditional or the contingent workforce, but it's also that us versus them notion. And it creates issues with engagement in the full-time workforce. So those are the issues. It's interesting that the engagement side did not come up very high on our poll today. So Michael, what are your thoughts on those concerns and the engagement side of the us versus them attitudes?
We are now taking a very serious look at this. So we've actually created a Contingent Worker Center of Excellence this past February, which is now part of, is now just moved into our talent acquisition organization as of our new organization changes on October 1st, specifically because the firm does have a significant number of contingent labor. We have a very seasonal business between audit and tax. If anybody thinks about an audit busy season or a tax busy season, or even the types of digital skills that you would bring to a consulting practice. So there's a very concerted effort going on inside the firm to understand more about them. We've just rolled out a contingent worker training for all managers. So if you're bringing or onboarding a contingent worker, you have to go through this training before you're allowed to do it in the system. We want you to know how to work with them, how to coexist with them, and how to help your team coexist with them. And then we've just did a training for all contingent workers on how to work at KPMG and what we expect in your relationship with us, along with values and behaviors to make sure you're emulating those in the same way that we are as employees. So I think that from a labor perspective, there's always going to be that line between how are you treating and are you putting these folks in the same team. Obviously, you can't invite them to holiday parties and luncheons and all hands meetings. There's rules and regulations against that, but you've got to find a way to understand the two audiences. And I think the last piece I would leave us with is, we have a large focus on KPMG being the employer of choice. We're starting to think about that brand for the contingents, so that even if you're only here with us for 6 months, when you leave, you had such a great experience, you had a great onboarding, we made it simple for you, you understood your place on the team, so that when you leave, you can tell someone else, we had a great experience at KPMG. So we're really trying to think of the experience just like you would an employee.
That's very enlightened. And Tanjali, at Merck, is there anything special on the contingent side that you're doing to facilitate the employee experience there?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think we're relatively, I would say we're early on in the journey when it comes to thinking about engagement for that side of the workforce. And it's a really important topic that we are paying a lot of attention to. I think this is the time for us to formulate that strategy. I think for me, coming from a workforce analytics background, one of the things that we need to work on is also having better data, right? So when it comes to things like engagement, survey vehicles are a great way to collect some of that information, be able to design certain processes or provide the right experience for our entire workforce, and including the contingent workforce. So I think when it comes to the contingent workforce, we don't always have the same level of information and hence the same level of experience that we can sometimes provide. So I think that's one thing that that's top of mind to work on.
We ended up by doing, as part of this too, we did a light version of our employee survey with them, a much lighter one, to understand how they felt about KPMG. Did they enjoy working here? Have they been getting the right experiences? So we've built that learning into the training and where we take this next.
I'm just conscious of the time. I just wanted to get to one last point. And I think this is more an issue that we're seeing starting to surface considerably within our member organizations. And I would point to in recent days the news with Amazon and its hiring algorithm that they never put into practice, but in the beta, I guess it started to surface a reinforce the bias, gender bias in the tech industry. It was very the hiring algorithm was keeping females out of the hiring pool. But I think this is just an interesting point that designing, working with the diversity D&I folks on the whole data collection gathering is really becoming a a big issue within our diversity and inclusion councils, and they are finding some pushback from the IT side. But I was just wondering, real quick, if this is an issue that you're addressing in either of your organizations.
It is actually. So for our kickoff tomorrow, the inclusion and diversity team is a thread throughout the pillars and cross pillars of our transformation, so that we can think about bias in the process as we actually do it. So we have a new chief diversity officer, another CDO, right? So there's two of those who just started a few months back, and she's been a breath of fresh air, and she's helping us think through it in a much different way.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I would say we work very closely with our diversity and inclusion team on many, many initiatives. And every time, I would say, whether it comes to diversity and inclusion, data privacy, data security, the first question we ask ourselves is, should we do this rather than can we do this? So there are many times that we move slower or go a different way than we originally would have if we hadn't asked those questions, because they're extremely important in doing not only what's possible, but doing what's responsible. So that's something that we take very seriously.
Now, I'm seeing we're at time. I would encourage our audience to download the presentation. There's a couple of slides that look at strategy and the consensus of what the future function is within HR going forward. So, as I say, we are at time. I would like to thank Michael and Gitanjali for their great wisdom and insights for our audience. I thought it was a very worthwhile and interesting conversation. I certainly learned a lot. And I'd just like to ask the audience to be aware of our next Human Capital webcast. That's on November 19th. And it's determining the business impact of employee engagement. So it's putting the dollars and cents to the soft stuff, if you will, right? So that's an important part. And one thing that we do ask is, if you're still with us, is to take a few minutes and to give us some feedback. Let us know what you liked, didn't like, how we did. I'll have my mom vote in favor of us. I'm sure she's there. So, but again, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation in this webcast. And again, thanks for the panel for some great insights. And until next time, this is it from New York and the Human Capital Watch.